Medscape and with my partner and great friend, Abraham Verghese. And today we have the delight of having a conversation with Melanie Mitchell, who is a professor both at Portland State and the Santa Fe Institute, and one of the go-tos for artificial intelligence, maybe the most clear-eyed person out there to give you the real skinny on what we know, what we don't know, and it's going to be a fun discussion. So Melanie, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
This book of artificial intelligence, I read it a year ago, a little more than that, I think, Guide for Thinking Humans, and now out in paperback, we highly recommend. It's got, the real kind of grounding force of how AI can help or potentially hurt. And I guess maybe we should just start off with that, Melanie, your kind of overview. Here is, late 2020. What do you think, where are we in the field of AI before we get into kind of medical and healthcare applications?
So AI's made a dramatic rise in progress over the last decade or so, largely due to what are called deep neural networks, deep learning, where deep in this sense really means the number of layers in a neural network. So neural networks are roughly modeled on the visual cortex in the brain, which is arrayed in a series of layers, roughly. And deep means the number of layers, so of simulated neurons. And this combined with very fast parallel computation and lots of big data for training has produced machines that can do a lot of tasks very well, such as speech recognition, object recognition and images, facial recognition, even powering autonomous vehicles, language translation, tasks in robotics. And it's been just dramatic how much improvement there's been in the field. But AI still remains quite narrow. Each machine is able to do its own narrow task, and there's no machine that really can do the kind of general intelligence or the ability to take knowledge in one domain and transfer it to another domain that is really the hallmark of human intelligence. Right. So I would say AI is doing quite well on the sort of narrow task front, but in terms of general intelligence, we're still quite far away.
Yeah, I had tagged so many things you wrote in the book, but one of the sentences that grabbed me was, deep learning is due less to new breakthroughs in AI than to the availability of huge amounts of data. Thank you, Internet, and very fast parallel computer hardware. So we have a deficiency of large annotated data sets in healthcare, as opposed to facial recognition and lots of other current uses. Is that a real bottleneck, do you think? Is that what's going to hold us back?
That's one of the bottlenecks, I would say. Yeah, so deep neural networks, the thing that's really given AI its oomph in the last decade, relies on large labeled training sets. And there's a lot of areas in medicine and other fields that don't have that. So they can't take advantage of it. There are some areas of medicine in which, as you know very well, AI is showing a lot of progress. I just read an article today about diabetic retinopathy and deep neural networks that are able to spot that better than human physicians. I mean, better than, I don't know exactly what that means, but so there are some pockets of AI applications that are really promising in medicine, but you're right, this idea of what's called supervised learning, where the machine has to be given lots and lots of examples that are labeled by a human. If you don't have that, maybe tens of thousands of examples are needed. If you don't have that, then it's hard to apply these new deep learning techniques.
Yeah, now just for our listeners, the approval of a device and an algorithm for diagnosing diabetic retinopathy in grocery stores, Safeway grocery stores, where an untrained person can put a patient, individual, shopper in the, get their retina scanned, and with a cloud algorithm and in deep learning, from what was the first prospective trial of AI in medicine, get a very accurate diagnosis of diabetic retinopathy. And of course, that's with half of people with diabetes never getting screened for diabetic retinopathy. So that's definitely an advance. Let me turn it over to Abraham.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. And I really enjoyed your book. It was a wonderful, deep introduction to AI for someone who's not very computer literate. But your journey was the most fascinating part of it, the way that you came to AI yourself, having not been a computer scientist. Maybe before we go much further, you can talk a little bit about that, your own personal sort of journey through this field.
Yeah, so my journey is a little different than most people, I think, in computer science who start out getting really obsessed by computers and video games and whatnot. I was never interested in computers at all. I was a mathematics major in college. Didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I read Douglas Hofstadter's book, Gödel, Escher, Bach, An Eternal Golden Braid, which was published in '79, so a long time ago. It was an amazing work of nonfiction that was really hard to classify. It's really about the emergence of consciousness or self-awareness or understanding from a substrate of neurons in which there is no consciousness or self-awareness in an individual neuron, but somehow together you get this emergence of this fantastic phenomenon we call intelligence. So that just made me decide that I really wanted to work in AI with Hofstadter. So I sort of persistently tried to convince him to let me join his research group, which finally he did. And I ended up doing a PhD with him. And
Yeah, I think
without ever having taken a computer science course, I got before I got to graduate school, which you could do in those days. I don't think you could do that anymore. I managed to get a PhD in computer science.
I think the fact that you're not a computer scientist before you started lends something to the book. I mean, there's a wonderful way of telling the story that you managed to do without assuming too much of your listeners, and yet challenging us with some of the math in there. So I really enjoyed it. I wanted to ask you about something that related to a paper I reviewed recently that had to do with trying to set up an ethical framework for every future AI application in medicine, so that I think the point of the paper was that too often we're coming to the ethical implications after the fact rather than prospectively considering the ethical implications at every level, from the nature of the researchers to the nature of the database, the data set, and so on. Maybe we can just jump into that, because I think every time people discuss machine learning in medicine, one of the big concerns is the lack of transparency for the clinician who's presented this diagnosis of diabetic retinopathy with no ability to sort of question it in the way we might a CAT scan or a biopsy report or something like that.
Yeah, the whole area of ethics in AI is really exploding, with people trying to think about kind of the complexities of it. And it's not just a simple matter of making sure the data doesn't have some kind of bias. We've seen, for instance, with facial recognition, which is a very prominent area now of AI application, that these machines that learn from human data, human labeled data that's often been downloaded from the web, that these algorithms can have bias against non-white, non-male faces. And it's not just a matter of fixing the data. The kind of bias goes way down into the depths of a lot of the way the data is collected, even cameras themselves, the technology of cameras that favor lighter skinned people in terms of how the image is processed, and how the data is collected, meaning how the people who are building the algorithms actually go about dealing with the data. And I think that's true in the medical sense as well. It's a very complex question of how to make sure that these machines aren't picking up all of the bias that goes into kind of human society. So I don't think anyone has the answer. One of the solutions that I've seen is, well, let's train the machines to have our kind of ethics, our moral values. Okay. But then that brings up the whole question of what our moral values are. How do we say even what our own ethics are? And how do we train a machine to do that when it's so hard to train a machine to have kind of a broad human concept in any domain? How do we train them to have moral concepts? How do we make these machines into moral philosophers? So it's really difficult. So I think that right now we have to have humans in the loop. Machines just don't have the ability to make these decisions autonomously without humans being able to make sure in some way that they're not biased or making some kind of mistake that's very unhuman-like. So that makes it difficult to, talk about how to sort of certify a machine as unbiased or trustworthy. I think that's the biggest, kind of obstacle to letting these machines be autonomous. Like even in the case of, diagnosing diabetic retinopathy, machines are not ready yet. They're not smart enough to be let to be autonomous, and we tend to trust them more than we should.
That's a critical point, and that's the problem. When our podcast, of course, is called Medicine and the Machine, not versus the machine. And it's always been pitted against ever since Gary Kasparov with the IBM Blue chess match. It's always been man versus machine, when in fact, in medicine, as you're aptly pointing out, Melanie, you still need to have oversight. In fact, you need to have training to understand the nuances. Like reading your book might be a good start for lots of physicians, but certainly in the curriculum of the future of medical school, this would seem like it'd be really important to understand why oversight is so important before you sign off that this treatment is indicated, this diagnosis is correct, that kind of thing. Just going back on this, today in the New York Times is this article, "Can we make our robots less biased than we are?" Which the point that Abraham was asking, you were responding to. One of the things that drives me a little cuckoo about computer scientists and AI is every AI problem, they have an AI solution. So privacy, check AI. Security, check AI. You name it, bias, ethics, using the AI. Now here, you kind of touched on this. I wonder if you could go a little deeper. To be able to detect through the network that there's bias, when it's basically almost all of this is embedded in our human culture, I don't see exactly how that's going to work. Can you help explain that a little more? Because it seems like it's asking too much of deconstructing a network.
Yeah. So one of the things about deep neural networks is that they're very opaque. Somebody described them as like a pile of linear algebra, because they just they're a bunch of numbers or vectors, if you like that term, that are being processed, and you can have millions, even billions of parameters, that is weighted connections in these networks that are really hard to look under the hood, if you will, and understand what's going on. It would be like if I sliced open your top of your head and looked at your neurons firing and tried to understand how you're thinking and how you made a decision. Obviously, that's not the right level at which to understand such a thing. So no one's been able to figure out exactly how to get these networks to either explain themselves or to be more transparent to humans as to how they're making decisions. So that's one of the problems. And of course, as you say, people in computer science, everything, they have a hammer and everything looks like a nail, and their hammer is technology. And so they think, okay, well, we've just got to apply more technology to solve this. Let's just get AI systems that look at neural networks and figure out how to explain them. Or let's just get AI systems to determine what the bias is. But I think people are recognizing more and more that it's not just a technical problem. It's a problem of society. It's a humanities problem. It's a problem of understanding human society, human nature, as much as it is of technology. So there's all kinds of new nonprofit institutes kind of cropping up, trying to bring together people from not only technology, but also from the humanities, from the social sciences, to really think about these problems. So I think people are getting to be more and more aware that these are not just technical problems, you know. And I think that, as you said, in the future, physicians, medical students, they're going to, anybody who's using these kinds of technological systems for human problems are going to have to learn about how to be critical thinkers about this technology, and also about the interaction with society.
No question. You know, one of my many favorite quotes in your book was by Mitch Kapoor, the Lotus 123 guy who I've met and know. He lives in the Oakland area. Anyway, you wrote, human intelligence is a marvelous, subtle, and poorly understood phenomenon. There is no danger of duplicating it anytime soon. And the fact that what we're talking about here is we need human intelligence to screen these algorithms. So, for example, the classic one of medicine now, of bias, is the Optum, published in Science last October, year ago, when basically they was discriminating against blacks because they weren't using medical resources, and basically, 70 million people of Optum were, being in daily use of this unwittingly, hurting as a bias. That wasn't going to be detected. And it seems so simple now in retrospect. Now the people at Optum said, well, how did we miss that? But it just is a lesson about how vital it is for the human intelligence to kick in from the outset and not rely on some algorithm that would be so widely disseminated that could do so much harm.
Yeah, I totally agree. The notion of common sense, which is an ill-defined term, but we kind of know what it means. It's now become a buzzword in AI. It's like, what machines lack is common sense. And people are talking about how do we define this? How do we give machines the kind of common sense that humans have, to see that, they should, machines can make these statistical correlations, but they're lacking this underlying notion of sort of how the world works. And your example is a great one for that. Anyone with common sense would not make those kinds of errors. But how do we give machines the kind of knowledge that even like a young child has? That's the paradox of AI. We have machines that can beat the best Go player in the world, but it's still a challenge to give a machine the common sense of an 18-month-old baby. And in fact,
Right.
that precise project is being carried out by DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which funds a lot of AI. They call it Foundations of Machine Common Sense, where they're trying to get machines to kind of mimic the developmental trajectory of babies. So that, I think, is a great, it's a great example of the paradox that we all face.
Just to turn that on its head, I mean, it strikes me that we're living at a time when at the highest levels, we're actually seeing a dearth of intelligence in terms of our responses to COVID. So on the one hand, you have, tremendous scientific, breakthroughs and clarity of understanding of a disease. And then you have the sort of social disorder at the very highest levels. I mean, just turning this question on its head, you see a role for artificial intelligence to be sort of a broker for society, so that we're not, opinions have become facts, and can a machine help us sift through all this and, get to what the facts really are, as opposed to the opinions that are really causing deaths every day because they're unfounded and they're incorrect much of the time.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really great question. The humans have common sense, but there's kind of a dark mirror of that, which is human cognitive biases, which can get
That's
us.
a kind way of putting it.
It can get us into trouble, and we see that all the time in our society, especially now with so much distrust of science, which I think is at the root of a lot of the problems we're seeing. Can AI fight that or help solve that? I'm dubious. Yeah, there's been a lot of talk, again, this sort of hammer of technology for all these problems. Let's use AI to combat misinformation.
Yeah.
Uh, that's, Facebook is Twitter, they're all trying to do that. But I think that it's a really, again, it's a problem that transcends technology and is beyond what AI can do now. So I'm not optimistic about the use of AI for uh, sort of spotting misinformation online and then labeling it. I'm I'm I think we have to have a more human solution to that problem. And I don't know what it is. I wish I did.
Can you give the story of Clever Hans?
Right. So Clever Hans was a horse, I think sometime back in the early 1900s in Germany, uh, who was supposedly able to do arithmetic. So the trainer would give Clever Hans some arithmetic problem, and Clever Hans would pound out the solution with its hoofs. Okay. And it turned out that Clever Hans was actually picking up on subtle body signals from the trainer, that Clever Hans couldn't do arithmetic, but could do kind of imitation or pick up on sensitive signal body language of the trainer, who is unconsciously kind of somehow giving clues to the solution. So a lot of people in AI have now, taken this metaphor of Clever Hans and said, sometimes what AI systems are doing is that they're learning subtle clues that aren't solving the problem we want them to solve, but that actually kind of give the impression that they are solving the problem. So, I think there's been some examples in the medical field with that, where, for instance, you try and get a machine learning system to learn to distinguish X-rays with, that have some pathology from X-rays that don't have the pathology. But then it turns out that the training data, the X-rays with the pathology, have some weird statistical anomaly that, or clue that they're from some different X-ray machine, or they're from some, there's some different setting being used that the machine, not apparent to us humans, but the machine is able to pick up on that to make the predictions.
Yeah, a
But
flagrant example that I'm familiar with. It might not quite fit into the Clever Hans model, but they did a skin lesion. Is it cancerous? And in the ones that had the marker in it, or the ruler, it was picked up because the ruler was there, and that's why it had this remarkable accuracy, because only the cancerous ones were measured. I mean, so yeah.
On the other hand, I think, I'm sorry, on the other hand, I think AI has done a good job on predicting mortality and tends to do it better than physicians, who tend to overestimate the success of a treatment or the 30-day mortality. And, I think that's another example of where the machine is unemotional in a sense and doesn't mix our intrinsic hope and wish for the patient into an inflated sense of how well they will do on this therapy or how much life they have left. And I think those kinds of applications are interesting to me, because I think they counter our bias. As opposed to making very clever diagnoses, they also are sobering, because this is a very human interaction otherwise, patient and physician. And I think we need more objectivity in some of those gray areas, such as predicting mortality and so on.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, that machines have biases, humans have biases. They're not exactly the same. And so if they work together, they can actually do better than either one of them working apart. But I think the human has to have a good understanding of what the biases are of the machine, if it's possible, and their own self-awareness. So that's,
Yeah.
I think, this human computer interaction area is key for us to understand more theoretically how we can complement each other. We humans and machines can complement each other.
The Abraham's example is notable because on the one hand, you can override some of the biases, but on the other, the physician might pick up, oh, this patient has a will to live. This patient is, is not going anywhere. That no algorithm is going to pick up things like that. So, it kind of goes both ways, and that's why this synergy, which isn't adequately still recognized today, of what machines can bring into medicine, and what the human factor can also enrich, and truly get some of the parts that's greater than either. It still isn't accepted. We have to keep working on it.
Yeah, I think one of the problems is that machines have been hyped a little bit too much, that they've been oversold, which, first of all, has the problem of making people trust them too much to be autonomous, to not need that human factor, but then ends up disappointing people and saying, well, they can't be trusted at all. So that I see as a big problem for adopting machines in a field like medicine. It's like, how can I trust this machine when it's made these errors? Because, I was sold on this idea that it was going to do much better than it would. I think, the IBM Watson was one example of that. It raises expectations too high. So I think we have to figure out exactly how we can represent what the machines can actually do and what their limitations are and what their role should be. That's kind of on us, the AI people, to make much clearer. And I don't think we've done a great job of that.
Well,
I think
go ahead, Abraham.
No, I'm sorry. I was just going to say that I think the burden is on our side to deal with whatever AI presents to us as a recommendation, just as the recommendation of a serum sodium is just a number that we then take. It's not a manifest instruction to do something. I think ultimately that should remain with us. And as you say, I think the hype of AI and machine learning is such that too often what's spit out is taken as being gospel, when it really is just another factor that you're being given that you need to weigh in, if I'm saying that correctly.
Yeah.
I was going to get to one of the things that I became your immediate friend, Melanie, when I was reading your book, was you went on about, speaking of hype, Ray Kurzweil, the singularity is near. Perhaps no one has hyped up AI more, that this is, going to, the transformation of life for the future and the singularity than Ray. Can you add a little color to that, because you did such a great job of kind of putting it in its place?
Well, Ray Kurzweil has been an AI promoter for decades. I think one of his first book was published at least 30 years ago. I'm not exactly sure when. Predicting that AI would reach human level intelligence by a certain date. I think it's 2029. He actually gives the exact date, which is kind of interesting. But then not only that, but going beyond that and saying, well, it's going to be billions of times smarter than humans by 2049. So he calls that the singularity, when machines sort of become smarter than humans. This idea goes back to science fiction, where the idea is that machines are able to, once they can improve themselves, that goes into a cycle of where they get smarter and smarter and smarter, and all of a sudden everything, they become billions of times smarter than we are. Okay, so he's written a lot of books that have been popular. Nobody I know who's serious researcher in AI believes this, but I think it's disseminated into the popular conception that we're right on the cusp of machines that are smarter than we are, and this is going to be an existential threat to us, to our culture, our society, our civilization, and we have to worry about that. And there's been any number of books that kind of riff on that idea.
Yeah.
But I think that's not a very serious concern. Andrew Ng, who's a well-known AI pioneer, said that worrying about singularity now is like worrying about overpopulation on Mars. it's just not the biggest problem with AI right now.
That's good. That's really good.
One of the exciting things for me in your book was helping me understand natural language processing. And here we are in 2020, and most clinicians I know, for every 1 hour we spend with the patient, we spend another 2 hours on the electronic medical record, and not to mention another hour at night with our inbox. And it seems to me that, we have all these brilliant breakthroughs with AI and retinopathy, but this is the area where we have the biggest need, is to have someone capture what we do seamlessly so that we can get on with the job. And I know both you and Eric are aware of many different applications and advances that might be coming, but would you talk a little bit about that, the advances in natural language processing that might really benefit medicine?
So natural language processing, what that means is, natural language means like human language. And there's been some advances that already benefit medicine, like speech to text, where you can transcribe your medical records by dictating them. My brother used to be a medical transcriber. That was his job. So he used to listen to doctors who dictated a recording of their notes, and he would transcribe them. But he's been put out of a job by natural language processing systems that do that. So that's been a big advance. And that's, surprisingly worked very well using these just kind of brute force statistical methods. These methods don't actually understand speech, but they transcribe them. And the same is true with translation, like between languages. You can translate, there's a lot of great translation systems that work pretty well. And it's pretty much brute force statistics. Now, I think what you're asking for are applications that could, for instance, do something more, which is actually understand the language. Like, for instance, sort of what IBM Watson was supposed to do, which was like read the medical literature and be able to answer questions about it that you might have, because you don't have time to read all the papers that are published. That turns out to be harder than translation or speech to text, because it actually requires some kind of understanding, I think, that's lacking in these other systems. Now, just exactly what that understanding is hard to pin down, but being able to make sense of, say, a paper, an academic paper, to be able to summarize it for you or answer your questions about it, that would be incredibly useful, I think. But it's something that AI still is, I think, fairly far away from.
Yeah, I think MD Anderson had a experience with that was far from successful with IBM Watson, but it seems to me they might have anticipated, or at least gotten it further along before they tried to implement it on that scale. Don't you think?
Yeah, I think that Watson was promoted so highly. That was the system that was able to win at Jeopardy, right? And Jeopardy seems like a really hard problem, that playing that game, but it turned out that system, that ability to do well at that game depended a lot on the fact that the questions were so well posed, and also there was so much training from previous games available. Whereas in the real world, like in medicine or law or any of these fields, it's so much more open-ended. The questions are not as well posed. There's not a clear answer all the time. And so it's much, much harder than people expected it to be. And that's kind of that sentence is the history of AI. It's much harder than people expected it to be for everything you want to talk about.
Yeah, and speaking of harder, replications become more of an issue in medicine. So, just earlier this year from China, they published a mortality model, going back to Abraham's point about mortality. They had these 3 biomarkers, CRP, the lymphocyte count, and the LDH, and they said they could predict accuracy of COVID mortality, over 90%. And then just recently in the last week in Nature Machine Intelligence, there were 3 reports from the US, from the Netherlands, from France saying that's a bunch of hooey. We can't even get 50% accuracy of those markers in our patients. So that's a replication issue, one that's really intriguing. MIT just published recently that if you had a forced cough, you would be able to detect from the cough with 98% accuracy without symptoms, whether you had COVID or not, in over 4,000 people without a replication. So Melanie, what do you make of all this? I mean, because replication obviously has been a big issue in medical research and in social science. Now we're starting to see it crop up in AI, in medicine and health.
Yeah, the replication has become, people are starting to talk about the replication crisis in AI. You know, we've heard about replication crises in other fields like psychology, but it's now an issue in AI because it's so hard to replicate a lot of the work that's been done. And, you know, it's like any other experimental field. You know, you don't think about doing something on a computer as being an experimental process, but it actually is, because there's so many different parameters in these systems and in the data and the way the data is processed that come into the study, that often there's some assumptions made by the researchers that they don't put in their paper, they don't even realize are there, and it makes it hard to replicate. So now there's becoming, in order to publish in certain journals, you have to show, you know, you have to give your code, you have to give all the details of your data, how you process your data and everything, because of this problem of replication. But I think that is, you know, that's a big issue. And you know, one problem is that in computer science, we're never trained in experimental science. You know, we're not trained with statistics and with the way that, you know, experimental science, you have to be able to how to do replicable science. That's not what our training is. And I think that's a problem, that it has to do with the education of computer scientists.
That's a really important point. You know, that kind of nails a critical issue. Yeah.
So I have a question for you and also for Eric, because Eric is really steeped in this field. If you were to put on your magic hat, your look into your crystal ball, it seemed like everything that was presented as a barrier to AI has been, not everything, but many things have been overcome that AI was supposedly not able to do. What do you think is coming down the pike? Where will we be 10 years from now with AI and medicine?
I think one of the most important areas right now is this idea of learning in a more human-like way. So I mentioned, you know, we talked about supervised learning, where you have to have lots and lots of human labeled examples. Clearly, that's not how humans learn. And in AI, people talk about this idea of transfer learning. That's a kind of a buzzword, which means being able to take what you learned in one domain and apply it in a different domain, you know, that you haven't learned about. So in human speak, that's what we call learning. That's what learning is. You know, if I learn something about something in a narrow domain and I can't apply it anywhere else, I haven't really learned the abstract concept, the fundamental concepts there. So this idea of getting away from this supervised learning and being able to do this kind of transfer of what I've learned here to another domain, that's really key. I think that's something that hopefully we will make a lot of progress on in the next 10 years. It's a big focus of research right now. And there's an area called meta learning, which has to do with learning how to learn, which is very promising also, I think. But, you know, these things are just at the beginning. And also being able to being able to quantify more how trustworthy a system is, sort of what its strengths and what its vulnerabilities are, and being able to communicate that to non-computer scientists like physicians, that's going to be key also. And that's something that we don't know how to do yet.
What do you think, Eric? What do you predict?
Well, I'm always the optimist and always have to reset on reality. That's the problem. But I'm hoping that imminently we can eliminate keyboards, and that will be in part what Melanie's referring to, in that, and you touched on, Abraham, that would be the singular big advance in the next couple of years that will change our time with patients and being able to truly be present, as you've written about so eloquently. But, I think longer term, the great ability of AI could be, the hospital reliance markedly reduced, that by data and algorithms that are validated to the hilt, replicated, and under continuous surveillance, that we will not know of hospitals like they are of today, where most of hospitals, of course, are people sitting in regular rooms, which they could be just as well be at home. So I think these advances should hit in the next several years. I'm excited about those, but it's going to be a long struggle to prove these things, because so much of today, and this goes back to one of I think Melanie's central points, we've relied so heavily on these in silico demonstrations and not in a real world setting. So just to go back to the diabetic retinopathy, which is one of the leading advances, when that was studied in silico by many different groups, like 4 different groups, they consistently got 98, 99% accuracy. When he did a prospective trial, the first one, by the way, in medicine, in the real world, the accuracy was good, but it wasn't 98, 99%, it was 90%. And that's what we have to, I think, be cognizant of, that, there's going to be a drop off of these pristine data sets. And that's why I turn back, to Melanie here, is that if we only can do supervised learning, we're going to be held back. And Jan LeCun, of course, is into semi-supervised learning. Or do you think that we can, and as you pointed out, transfer learning, these new ways of learning, can we make this jump imminently, or is that pretty far off?
I think within the next decade, we'll see a lot of progress there. I don't think we're going to get to, what we might call human level intelligence. But I do think that we'll be able to make some progress on making machines more trustworthy, more able to do this kind of transfer, more able to learn in a not so supervised way, however that pans out. So I'm optimistic like you. And I think there are some amazing potential applications for AI. A lot of people always ask, why even do this? Like, why AI could be so harmful, and we've seen so many bad things about it. Why do this research? And I think, that's true, but there's also some amazing possible benefits. And I think medicine's one of the main areas in which we'll see that in the near term. And, there's so many problems with people in areas like that don't have the kind of healthcare that we might have in a big city, for example, or that, as you say, would be much better off at home than in a hospital, or, are elderly and, can't access care the way that healthy people can. I think that there's a lot of potential for AI systems to assist doctors, not to replace them in any sense, and we've heard from people like Jeff Hinton, oh, we're not going to need radiologists in 5 years. That's obviously not true. But I think that we'll get a lot more AI as assistants to help physicians broaden their ability to care for people. And I'm quite optimistic about that.
Yeah, and one other point I think deserves mention: when we talk about medicine and the machine, we don't give enough respect to patients and the machine. We always think of it as, the doctors and nurses and other clinicians, but the ability for people to generate their own data, whether it's through sensors, whether it's through access to their electronic records, and, all their different nodes of getting data on themselves, and the support of algorithms could be a big change in the future that I think Abraham was getting to. Well, I think this has been a fun discussion because you've, Dr. Mitchell, you've been so great in pointing out these areas of concern and are also areas of optimism we have for deep learning and essentially deep neural networks as we go forward, of course, in the rest of our world, and especially where it can take us in medicine. So thanks so much for being with us. Abraham, any parting words for Melanie?
I just want to recommend to our listeners, your book is, really wonderful. It's a beautiful introduction and, a deep dive into AI for people who are not computer scientists. And so thank you for writing it and being so eloquent. Great to have you on this podcast.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's been fun talking to you.
And Melanie, what's next for you? Where are you headed? Are you going to write another book, or are you going to set the AI world on fire? What's your next chapter?
Oh, wow. Hard to say, but I'm right now I'm thinking a lot about how people make analogies, how they process metaphors, how they understand abstract concepts, and trying to think about how we can do that in machines.
That's great. Well,
Wow.
Thanks so much for enlightening us today and to our listeners. And we look forward to following you really closely because you're going to continue to help this field, and it needs all the help it can get. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And that's it for this episode of Medicine and the Machine. Remember, there's a full transcript of this interview at medscape.com. Medicine and the Machine is hosted by Dr. Eric Topol and Dr. Abraham Verghese and is produced by Medscape editor Robbie Atuma.